So when we look at gender-based abuse, we often talk about gender of the perpetrator rather than gender of the victim. My name is Luke Martin. I'm a specialist consultant on domestic abuse and sexual violence based in the UK. The data that we have in the UK is 1 in 6 boys and men will experience sexual assault. We've just released our crime survey in England and Wales data for this year, which looks at actually we're more likely to see young boys experiencing sexual assault when we look at the division of age. It's really hard to capture data because what we'll find is that men access potentially different service provisions. It's hugely challenging because we don't know how underreported these experiences are. So when we think about the development of domestic and sexual abuse services, it's survivors who have come forward and developed those services. If men are already working full-time jobs, some of the men that I've supported, they've had second, third jobs to bring in the income that's expected from their partner. Actually, they've often got established career paths already. So they don't necessarily have the capacity to then go off and set up grassroots organisations, although we've got an organisation here in the UK called Mankind, which was established by a man alongside his full-time jobs. We've had some quite high-profile cases here in the UK. One of the pieces of work that I've done historically is sitting on what we have the independent inquiry into childhood sexual abuse. And there were huge amounts of findings that came out with regards to that around sexual abuse within institutions. So whether that was within care homes, boarding schools, but one of the areas that was explored in quite a lot of depth was football clubs for boys and young men. And actually, when we saw those findings being released, we did see an increase in men coming forward talking about their experiences. I think especially when we're exploring sexual violence, it's something that's still very much a taboo because it goes against this notion of really harmful masculinities, that men should be almost predatory in their sexual behavior, that men should want sex all of the time. That's the messaging that's still kind of given in society. So that pushes against these experiences of sexual violence where that sexual activity is unwanted because there's an element of societal pressure that men should want sex all of the time. So I think that's one of the barriers that we have. The other challenge that we have is that a lot of our sexual violence services are sitting under the gendered umbrella. So as a male victim survivor, you might not feel able to go to these mainstream services because if you look on their websites, if you get leaflets on them, you're probably going to look at them and think that it's not a service that's suitable for you. I mean, I think it's a societal presumption that men are going to have a high libido. I've just actually bought a book called Testosterone Rex, which looks at challenging some of these myths around gender and expectations. I think what we see is this adultification of young boys, especially around sexual activity. This expectation that actually boys will become sexually active at an earlier age, and we see this glamorizing, especially of women who engage in ultimately groom young children and engage in sexual activity with them. We don't often use the same language. Here in the UK, our definition of rape can't be applied to a woman who sexually assaults a man. So there's a challenge in language itself that we would consider it a sexual assault. And although both crimes carry the same sentencing, what we see in society is that sexual assault is often perceived as this lesser offence. So there's challenges around that. I think there's challenges around men and boys coming forward. We look at data that we have around how long it takes for a man to come forward to talk about experiences of sexual assault, and my local sexual violence did some research with their survivors, and what they found was that a majority of them waited on average 35 years before disclosing to anybody, and a huge amount of that's around not being believed. That when we look at boys and men's experiences of sexual assault and rape, what we'll often see is that there's a huge amount of coercion into that, this misconception that the person wanted that. We don't see maybe physical harm or penetration in the same way, But what we will see is a huge amount of emotional abuse sitting within that, or psychological abuse. When we think about adult survivors, it's often around put downs around their performance, the size of their penis, not being able to maintain an erection. Because of the physiological reaction, a male who's sexually assaulted might get an erection. If they're anally penetrated, they might ejaculate. So there might be some questioning around sexual orientation there, because there's a physiological reaction which is often associated with an enjoyment of sexual activity. So I think there needs to be this distinction between something that your body is doing automatically and separating that from a sense of enjoyment and engagement and consent in sexual activity. So there can be potentially this questioning of sexual orientation. What we see when we think about an experience of sexual violence is somebody having that control taken away from them, that somebody in a position of power has abused that power. So what we might see is a development of obsessive behaviours, because what we often look for when we feel like control is being taken away from us is other areas in our life where we can regain some of that control. So we might change our eating habits and develop eating disorders. We might become very obsessive around things like our appearance or exercise, to the point where it becomes unhealthy because it gives us a sense of controls. But it will impact potentially people's relationships in the future, how they connect with others, because again, we're looking at this sense of lack of safety. So they may not feel safe in intimate relationships. They may be triggered by things like physical touch. We might see that somebody avoids contact with groups of people, with adults of a specific age or gender, because of the experiences that they've had. Even coming back to the example that you've just used of Al Spencer, that his experience will have been different because it was perpetrated by a woman. And if we don't focus on the differences, we get quite lazy with what our service provision looks like. So we need to focus on what is similar, which ultimately is domestic abuse, sexual violence, but also what are the differences in those experiences, because that provision of service then looks very different, in the way that if we use that example, we need something that's going to be available for men later on in life when they feel able to disclose. But also we then need to work back and think about what we're doing that's failing young boys that meant that he wasn't able to access that help and support. And why are we having these conversations in schools with young girls around being open and honest around experiences of sexual abuse and not having that conversation with boys and young men?